Alright, so the year is 1910, and America is facing two big problems. The first is a critical meat shortage. These were the peak years of immigration, cities were exploding, and as Upton Sinclair noted, the meat industry was getting bigger and uglier in response. But try as they might, no amount of mechanization, or hiring, or fingers and rats thrown in at processing plants could keep up with the exponentially increasing demand. And at the same time, we were losing our sense of identity. The frontier had always defined American culture, and now, with no more frontier left to explore, many feared that our spark of democracy, of innovation, and of unconventionalism was fading. So we needed someone who could step up and remind the world of our place, to prove that America still had the youth and the vibrancy to deal with its problems with panache and flair. And we got that person, two people actually, Frederick Burnham and Fritz Duquesne. They'd actually been mortal enemies in the Second Anglo-Boer War, master spies tasked with each other's assassination. But both were American patriots at heart. And when the nation was grappling with what leading scholars of the time termed the meat question, they were able to set aside their differences to work towards a solution for everyone. They realized that America had finally run out of grazable land, and that attempts to pack livestock more tightly would turn out to be ultimately futile. They knew that the only solution to the crisis was to re-examine the resources that America already possessed and find some mechanism of converting them into meat. For this, they looked to the swamps and bayous of the South. Here were vast swaths of untapped potential. And Burnham, widely traveled throughout Africa, knew just the animal for the job. The hippopotamus. Bear with me here, I promise I'm going somewhere with this. By resettling imported specimens in semi-aquatic ranches, he could simultaneously subdue the invasive plants, provide Americans with a new source of nutritious meat, and restore the nation's hope. It was a bold and daring plan, backed by surprisingly legitimate science, and it almost succeeded. But under pressure from the conservative Department of Agriculture, as well as established farmers and companies, Congress narrowly failed to pass the so-called Hippo Bill. The swamps were eventually converted into beef-friendly cropland, but this real issue of sustainable meat production was never fully resolved. And today we face a meat question of our own, only this time we've actually got too much of the stuff. The average American consumes over 270 pounds of meat per year, more than twice the global average. Our consumption is off the charts, with disastrous consequences on the environment. A single quarter-pound beef hamburger represents an ecological investment of over 6 pounds of feed, 50 gallons of water, 70 square feet of cropland, and 1 million joules of energy. Pork, poultry, and fish are somewhat more efficient, but they still fall far below the threshold of long-term sustainability. And with worldwide meat consumption projected to nearly double by 2050, it's clear that we have to find a solution as soon as possible. So what are our options? Well, the obvious answer is vegetarianism. I've grown up in a divided, but let me explain why I don't believe that vegetarianism represents a long-term solution. I've grown up in a divided household. My mom has been vegetarian since she was a teenager, while meat is an essential part of my dad's culture. But because he's a Buddhist and a health freak and loves her very much, he's tried time and again to embrace her way of life. I can't even count the number of times that I've come home to find him cooking a tempeh stir-fry or grilling mushroom burgers, having cheerfully thrown out all of the meat in our house in an attempt to stick to the resolution this time. But within a couple of weeks, he always cracks and we relapse back into our old ways. It's not that he has particularly weak willpower. Recent studies have shown that 84% of Americans who give up meat eventually return to eating it. At the same time, the 3% rate of vegetarianism in the US shows no sign of increasing in the near future. But we shouldn't be ashamed of eating meat. However, we do have a moral imperative to try to do it in a way that causes the least harm and suffering possible. And this is where this guy comes in. Dr. Mark Post is an MD, PhD, and professor of vascular physiology at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. He's also the driving force behind this, the world's most expensive burger. At $325,000, it might seem a little bit expensive, but it makes sense when you find out where it comes from. This fairly average-looking piece of meat didn't come from a slaughterhouse or a farm or even any animal in the traditional definition of the word. Nor is it plant-based. Like most meat alternatives on the market today. Actually, it was grown in Dr. Post's lab, cultured from a sample of bovine muscle cells. His team painlessly extracted the cells from a living cow, then carefully fed and nurtured them for 3 months so that they would multiply to create muscle tissue, which is the main component of the meat we usually eat. So it's not a beef substitute, it is beef. Totally free of animal cruelty, and produced in an environment without exposure to any kind of bacterium, toxin, or disease. The cost was admittedly high for this prototype, but it could be made as cheap as $30 per pound, quote, even with current technology. And there are strong signs that the same technology could be applied to other forms of meat in the future. University of Oxford research suggests that this type of meat production could require only 55% of the energy and 1% of the space needed by traditional methods, while producing only 5% of the greenhouse gases. Predictably, a lot of controversy has sprung up around this topic. Some of you probably have your own doubts, maybe about its potential impact on the established agricultural industry. But I believe that farmers and companies will still have an important role to play, partnering with scientists to help make the world a better place for future generations. Just like in 1910, modern America stands once more at a crossroads, and it's a crossroads that we all face in our own lives as well. When presented with something like this, something new and unfamiliar, we're often tempted to isolate ourselves in fear and anxiety. But nothing good can come of this, and on a national level, it would mean falling behind the rest of the world and continuing to squeeze resources out of a planet that has precious little left to give. Or we can work to overcome our prejudices and reclaim our culture of progressive and independent thought, taking up the mantle of Burnham and Duquesne and leading the people of the world into a more egalitarian, prosperous, and sustainable future. This time, we can choose to embrace the hippopotamus.